So, today I want to talk about food shortages, drought, and climate change. The global problem of food insecurity has always been one of access. We have historically had enough food to feed everyone on the planet for at least decades at this point. That said, we have created an economic system that not only makes food inaccessible to large swathes of the global population, but has blamed those without access for their own poverty and inability to afford the very foods they often grow. It is the very same economic system which has damaged the planet beyond repair and created rising temperatures that are now starting to threaten access to food even further. As we have seen from report after report, even the most generous predictions seem to indicate that even if we stopped all global output of emissions, that we would still see a rise of average global temperatures of about 1.5 degrees Celsius. More than likely, given the current reality that we live in, we will see a rise in global temperatures approaching 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, as there is no sign of the wealthiest people or nations actually changing their policies beyond lip service. As this changes, we will see more and more cases of extreme weather events, which will eliminate any consistency in the growing of crops, and that will result in further food shortages. That said, when we speak on food shortages, it is always important to remember that the wealthiest people on the planet will not experience anything resembling a shortage. As prices rise, they will be the ones legally equipped with the right to eat. It will always be those at the bottom of the economic hierarchy of global capitalism that will suffer the most, just as it has always been. The problems in these instances will just be exacerbated. That said, right at this moment, several crops from around the globe are experiencing lower yields, including several staple crops. And this is having a profound impact on people's lives across the globe. So let's take a look at what's going on. We have here an article that's focused primarily on sriracha and the fact that red jalapeno chili peppers have actually been not available in recent years. That said, this article does a really good job at highlighting some of the specific instances across the globe of crops starting to see lower yields and how that has been tied to climate change and the inconsistency that we're seeing from extreme weather events. So we start off with these red jalapeno chili peppers that have been made worse due to severe weather and drought conditions in Mexico. Now, it's worth noting that the effects that are happening in Mexico, a lot of that is tied to the same things that are happening on the west coast of the United States, where there's massive droughts that are occurring. A lot of the same waterways that feed and provide water for a lot of the people in the west coast of the United States funnel into northern Mexico. And so it is these same water resources, whether these borders exist or not, that are shared and therefore have a connection between the growing of crops in these two different regions economically and politically. Just because they are divided by this line doesn't mean that they are not drawn together through environmental factors. And so when the US uses up and the seven states that use up all that water consistently continue to do so, it will be northern Mexico that doesn't have access to it. And so drought and weather conditions will actually be exacerbated in this region. Again, we're all in this together, and that's worth mentioning. But it's not just chili peppers. Mustard producers in France and Canada said that extreme weather has actually caused a 50% reduction in seed production last year, leading to a shortage of the condiment on grocery store shelves. Blistering heat, stronger storms, droughts, floods, fires, and changes in rainfall patterns are also affecting the cost and availability of staples including wheat, corn, coffee, apples, chocolate, and wine. Now, it's worth pausing on that because when we talk about staples, wheat, corn, and what isn't mentioned here but rice make up the bulk of a lot of the diets of people across the globe. And if you're seeing a decrease in wheat, corn, and rice production globally, that means that a lot of the calories that make up a lot of people's diets are going to suddenly disappear and are going to rise in cost to the point where only the wealthiest people can afford them. And those at the bottom rungs of society, as we have seen and as we know, will not be able to afford the very foods they're growing, which make up the bulk of their diet. And that is going to be a huge problem that is going to lead to the devastation of a lot of the major, groups of people on this planet. You're going to see massive famines. You're going to see things go wrong as these staple crops are the ones to disappear. And while coffee, apples, chocolate, and wine are major products for the West, it is really wheat, corn, and rice that I see as the most fearful to lose on a global scale. The climate crisis is increasing in intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, and it's putting food production at risk. For some of the examples that it shows, wheat and other grain crops are particularly vulnerable. In the Great Plains, where most of the US's wheat is harvested, drought depressed the winter crop. And of course, that's just in the US. The impact on the climate crisis and all of this goes far beyond the United States. In India, a fierce heat wave damaged the wheat crop due to record setting temperatures throughout the spring and summer. As Delhi hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That is ridiculously hot. And people actually have to go out and, harvest these crops and plant these crops and deal with these crops in this extreme weather. And that's just in May. That's not even the hottest time of year in India. Meanwhile, you have the government there banning exports on wheat for good reason, while that is driving up the price even further because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the Ukraine is one of the biggest wheat producers globally. And so not only do we have the factor of climate affecting these crops, but it's actually now war and the continued war that will likely exist as nations go into conflict with each other over resources in the coming years that will further exacerbate the global problems that we're having in terms of making sure that everyone has enough to eat. Factor that all in with capitalism, and you have a recipe for disaster. But pausing for a moment and zooming a little further into the situation in India, we have that while heat waves are not uncommon in the season preceding the monsoon, the very high temperatures so early in the year, coupled with much less than average rain, led to extreme heat conditions with devastating consequences for public health and agriculture. Early reports indicated about 90 deaths. That has likely increased a lot more since the time of this reporting in India and Pakistan, and we've seen 10 to 35% crop reductions in certain regions. The dry heat wave has mainly affected people who have to go outside to earn a daily wage, and also lack access to consistent electricity and cooling at home, which limits their options to cope under prolonged stress of heat. Now, it should be obvious to state this, but I'm going to state it anyway. If you spend the majority of your day in high heat situations and you're out of the house and you have no access to cooling, maybe you don't have access to a lot of water or maybe not access to clean water, and you can't continually hydrate, that is going to lead to heat stress, that's going to lead to heat stroke, that's going to lead to people dying. And so a lot of the people who are going out daily to grow these crops in these extreme weather temperatures, this massive drought that's occurring in India with 120-degree Fahrenheit temperatures, we're going to see people perish in that, just so the rest of the world can eat. And that's more than messed up. That's the nature of capitalism, though, where the people who are growing these crops are at the bottom rungs of society globally and are not given the things they need in order to continue to produce crops to feed people in the wealthiest nations. Rising temperatures from more intense and frequent heat waves will render coping mechanisms inadequate, as conditions in some regions meet and exceed limits to human survivability. Like, that's what we're talking about and dealing with all of this. People are actively going to perish, in addition to the fact that it's difficult to grow in these arid conditions. So, as we mentioned, about 90 deaths were estimated during the 2022 heat wave at the point of the writing of this article. But you also have forest fires and other factors that are increasing the difficulty at producing crops. The heat reduced India's wheat crop yields, causing the government to reverse an earlier plan to supplement the global wheat supply that has been impacted by the war in Ukraine. Around mid-April, India's Prime Minister Modi said that the country had enough food for 1.4 billion people and was ready to send food to the rest of the world in the aftermath of soaring food prices due to the war in the Ukraine. Now, the thing is that decision makes sense. yes, it's causing an economic problem for the rest of the globe. But if you have a situation where you're not able to produce enough food for your own people, you cannot be exporting all that wheat outward. People need to eat, especially the people who are producing the products in the first place. If you don't have people able to go out and make these products because they can't eat, how are they supposed to feed anyone else? There's that old saying that you have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of other people. We see that as an example on an airplane. They always say put the mask on yourself first before you put it on your child even. This is the kind of situation that people are in across the globe where they're going to have to do this. What I'm fearful of is in the coming years is that a lot of the larger, wealthier nations, a lot of the nations with larger militaries, are going to use their position and influence and power, either economically or militarily, to start to go into these regions and start reinforcing more obvious colonial measures. This is already an imperial measure where all of this wheat is extracted. But we might see a shift in policy where more explicit colonial measures are used in order to secure wheat production for the rest of the globe at the cost of people in these regions. That said, going back to what's occurring right now and getting out of that realm of scary future speculation that unfortunately has a lot of basis in reality, um, the climate change could seriously affect the global production of maize and wheat as early as 2030, with maize crops yields estimated to decline by 24%. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that that is the bulk of global calorie consumption. It's those two crops and rice. If we see those fail, that is going to lead to a lot of people dying. There's going to be massive famines. Apples are another food already at risk. Last year's apple harvest in Michigan and Wisconsin was compromised because of heavy frost in the spring. So while drought is one of the biggest causes, heavy frost in the spring is another factor. We're seeing these large temperature shifts that are occurring, where in the springtime, the temperature can go down below where it's supposed to and then rise instantly back up to where it's supposed to be and beyond. So we're seeing a lot of situations where the combination of frost with high temperatures within a very short span of time is damaging a lot of crops. Meanwhile, we see that coffee prices increased by 70% after droughts and frost destroyed crops in Brazil, the world's largest coffee producing economy. The economic ramifications could be profound, since it's estimated that as many as 120 million people of the world's poorest depend on coffee production for their survival. Meanwhile, the climate crisis will also change where farmers can grow things like cacao, and a shortage of chocolate products is expected in the coming years due to drier weather in West Africa. Meanwhile, last year, France's wine industry saw its smallest harvest since 1957. And if we see temperatures rise by 2 degrees Celsius, wine growing regions could shrink by as much as 56%. 4 degrees of warming could mean 85% of those areas are no longer able to produce good wines. And so this is more or less what we're dealing with. And I have to say, when it comes to extreme weather events like this, the biggest issue will always be consistency. It's not just the fact that we're getting these weird moments of weather, but agriculture requires a certain level of predictability about the land and the climate in order to successfully grow crops. What time of year do you put the seeds in the ground? When is the harvest? How many harvests can happen in a year? When do things happen? How do things occur? These are the types of questions that can only be answered with predictable outcomes. And it's the answers to these questions that farmers need to have and agricultural producers need to have in order to secure a large yield of crops. These forms of extreme weather are not in any way predictable. Early spring freezes, drought-like summer conditions, forest fires, or massive storms can have devastating tolls on plant life and ecosystems. Drought is also one of the most frightening because water is necessary no matter what. It's necessary for people, it's necessary for plants, and it's necessary for livestock. Without access to enough clean water, crops don't grow. And that will result in lesser yields, which will exacerbate all of these problems. Now, I do want to put all of this into context. The United States has reserves of soy, maize, and other staple foods that it has collected from programs of farm subsidies, where it buys up massive quantities of these crops annually. Cumulatively, the United States is not experiencing a food shortage, even as all of these crops fail globally, and as all of these particular products do not end up on store shelves. The world as a whole still has enough food, even with what's going on to feed everyone on the planet and more. That said, because of capitalism and the way we choose to distribute food, the poorest people, even in a wealthy country like the United States, will likely experience inflation that will drive up prices into ranges where many foods become quite pricey and potentially out of the reach of certain populations. And while all of this may seem devastating to those who purchase these types of products that are becoming increasingly scarce, this is going to have a far greater and more profound impact on those who grow these crops, especially those in the global south. Under the current system of global capitalism, the people who grow these crops rarely get to enjoy the products they grow. Colombia, for example, has historically been one of the largest exporters of coffee to the United States, and yet its citizens often only get the lowest quality coffee products for themselves. And in many cases, it was rebranded products by large companies like Nestle, selling products back to the people who grew it in the first place. You can see this phenomena happen basically in so many of these crops. When it comes to cocoa, beef, bananas, palm oil, sugarcane, and so many more products. The growers of these cash crops that get exported primarily to Western nations depend on this income for survival. And as the climate gets worse and worse, it'll be these people who are affected first and foremost, as food distribution retains this colonial, imperial, and capitalist flavor. That's not even counting the fact that many are going to perish in the high temperatures and extreme weather that occurs in all of these different regions, because it's going to be unsafe to go out and grow crops in some of these areas. And these problems are only going to get worse with time. As the climate begins to change more and more, food production is going to get more and more difficult, and we will continue to see crop yields lower. That doesn't mean that we don't have the tools to try to prevent further massive global famines. As usual, those tools are locked behind the interests of wealthy private owners of land and resources who continually uphold global capitalism as a solution to the problem of access that it has created, maintained, and exacerbated for years. We need to see a change in how we distribute food, what we prioritize, and come together in order to solve the human issue of food access. Addressing food scarcity means addressing global wealth inequality. It means lowering emissions, and it means addressing capitalism as the global force of harm that it remains. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as consider joining my Discord to have conversations about topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. That said, the links for everything are in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.